The transport ship rocked against the wooden pier, its metal groaning under the weight of hundreds of weary men. The air smelled of salt and rust, and for the first time in months, Corporal Kenji Takahashi felt the steady ground beneath his feet. The American soldiers shouted orders in a language he only half understood, their rifles hanging casually at their sides, not in menace, but in procedure. Kenji had expected cruelty. He had imagined cages, starvation, humiliation. Instead, as the prisoners were led through the gates of Camp Roten in Arkansas, he saw rows of clean barracks, trimmed grass, and a white chapel standing quietly beyond the wire fences. It was nothing like the nightmare he'd prepared for. A young American guard with sandy hair, Sergeant William Harris, guided them toward their quarters. His voice carried no anger, only routine discipline. "Keep moving, fellas. You'll get food and water soon." The tone confused Kenji. Was this an act? A deception? He kept his eyes low, uncertain of what soon meant in the language of victors. Inside the barracks, the men were given blankets, soap, and bowls of stew. The warmth of the food made Kenji's stomach twist with guilt. Around him, his comrades murmured in disbelief. "They feed us," one whispered. Another laughed bitterly. "Perhaps they fatten us before execution." When the lights dimmed, Kenji lay awake, listening to the chirping of insects outside the window. Beyond the fence, he heard faint laughter. American soldiers sharing stories, perhaps thinking of home. He closed his eyes, thinking of Kyoto, of the quiet rhythm of chalk on a classroom board, of his students bowing before lessons. Those memories felt like another lifetime. In his mind, he repeated the words of his capture, "You will serve with honor even in defeat." But what did honor mean here, in a land where enemies smiled and offered bread? The next morning, Harris called the group for orientation. "You'll be treated fairly as long as you follow the rules. Work is available if you want it. You'll even be paid." The statement rippled through the crowd like a wave. Paid? To work for the enemy? Kenji stared at Harris, searching for mockery, but found none. As he stood there, the sun rising over the distant cotton fields, a thought struck him with quiet unease. Perhaps this war would test more than loyalty. It would test what it meant to be human. If you find this story as surprising as Kenji did, subscribe, because what happens next will challenge everything you thought you knew about war. The mornings at Camp Roten began with the clang of a bell that echoed across the yard, cutting through the mist that still clung to the trees. Kenji woke to the scent of coffee and cornbread drifting from the mess hall, a smell so foreign it made him uneasy. Outside, rows of men lined up, their khaki uniforms pressed and numbered, watched by guards who stood at ease, rifles slung low. Life inside the fence followed a rhythm that was both strange and orderly. The men were assigned tasks. Some cleaned the barracks, others tended the vegetable gardens, and a few worked in the camp's woodshop. There was no shouting, no beatings, no cruelty, only the mechanical routine of survival. Yet the absence of violence made Kenji even more suspicious. He had been raised to believe the Americans were monsters. Monsters didn't serve fresh bread or allow men to read books. After breakfast, an announcement came through the loudspeaker. "Volunteers for English classes, report to Building C." Kenji hesitated, but went. The room smelled of chalk and dust. At the front stood Sergeant Harris, sleeves rolled up, a pencil behind his ear. "We'll start simple," he said, writing hello on the board. In America, it's polite to look a man in the eyes when you greet him. Kenji tried the word, his accent heavy. Harris nodded approvingly. "Good. That's better than most new recruits I trained." The class laughed softly. Kenji couldn't tell if it was mockery or warmth, but for the first time the sound didn't sting. Later, during a break, he sat beneath the fence's shadow, staring at the horizon. Beyond the wire, he saw farmland stretching for miles, dotted with oak trees and barns. Freedom was close enough to see, yet unreachable. Around him, the men spoke in low voices. "They treat us too kindly," muttered Private Ito. "It's a trick." Kenji nodded slowly. "Maybe. Or maybe they've already won so completely that kindness costs them nothing." That night, as lamps flickered and the cicadas hummed, Kenji opened the small notebook he'd smuggled through capture. He wrote a single line in careful strokes. "Even inside a fence, a man must choose who he becomes." Outside, Harris made his final round, pausing near the barracks. Through the dim light, he saw Kenji writing and smiled faintly. The guard didn't know what words filled the page, but he knew that inside those fences, something more than discipline was taking root. The sun over Arkansas burned brighter than anything Kenji had known in Japan. By mid-morning, the prisoners were marched beyond the fences, escorted by a handful of guards to a vast stretch of farmland that rolled like waves under the summer heat. The cotton fields shimmered white and endless, and the air buzzed with cicadas so loud it drowned out thought. Kenji's hands, once used to holding chalk, now gripped the rough handle of a hoe. The soil was soft, rich and strange beneath his feet. Sweat traced lines down his face, and he felt the ache of work that served no emperor, no homeland, only the enemy's harvest. Harris walked the rows with a clipboard, stopping now and then to speak with the farm owner, a middle-aged man in suspenders and a straw hat. The man's tone was casual, even friendly. "They work hard," he said, glancing at Kenji's group. "Better than some of my regulars." Harris gave a half-smile. "Discipline runs deep with them." At midday, they rested beneath the shade of a pecan tree. An American guard handed out tin cups of water. Kenji hesitated before accepting his. "It's safe," Harris said quietly, standing nearby. "We don't poison the people who do our work." The sarcasm was mild but not cruel. Kenji drank the water shockingly cold and nodded. When the day ended, the men were gathered near the truck for roll call. An officer announced through a translator that each man would receive a small payment for his labor, credits that could be used in the camp store. The words stunned them. Money. For prisoners. Back in the barracks, the news spread like fire. Some cheered, others scoffed. "They insult us," hissed Ito. "They think coins can buy our loyalty." But Kenji remained silent. That night, he unfolded a sheet of paper to begin a letter home, though he knew it would be censored. "Mother," he wrote, "we are fed and we work under the American sun. They say they will pay us for it. I do not understand this kindness. Perhaps it is another way of winning." He stopped, unsure how to end the sentence. Outside, laughter drifted from the guards' quarters, a sound so ordinary it was almost unbearable. Kenji laid his pencil down and whispered into the quiet, "If work can bring peace even for a day, perhaps it is worth doing." The work days settled into a quiet rhythm, yet tension grew among the men like an invisible current beneath calm water. Each evening, after returning from the fields, the prisoners gathered in small circles, whispering about what their labor truly meant. Some said it was survival, others said it was betrayal. Kenji kept mostly silent, preferring the comfort of his thoughts. But one night, as he polished his boots near the barrack steps, Lieutenant Hirose approached. Once a proud officer in the Imperial Army, Hirose carried himself with unbroken posture, his voice sharp and deliberate. "Takahashi," he said, "you work as if you've forgotten who you are." Kenji looked up slowly. "I haven't forgotten," he replied. "But a man must eat. We do what is required." Hirose's eyes narrowed. "Required by whom? These Americans? You would trade your honor for a plate of their food and a few coins." His words cut through the air. The others around them fell silent. Kenji felt the heat rise in his chest. "Honor does not live in hunger," he said carefully. "If survival shames me, then shame is a small price for another sunrise." Hirose turned away, disgusted. "You sound like them already. Do you think they respect us because they pay us? They laugh behind your back. You are a tool in their field." The next morning, the argument lingered like a stain. As Kenji worked, he caught the sideways glances of men who now doubted him. Some refused to take their pay, calling it blood money. Others pocketed it quietly, pretending it didn't exist. The camp had split in two, those who worked and those who refused. At dusk, Harris approached Kenji as he stacked wooden crates by the shed. "Trouble in your ranks?" he asked. His tone was more curious than stern. Kenji wiped his hands on his trousers. "Some men think work makes us weak." Harris nodded slowly. "Funny. I found it's the opposite." That night, Kenji lay awake, staring at the wooden ceiling above him. He wondered what his students from Kyoto would think if they saw him now, a soldier turned laborer in enemy land. Was he a disgrace or a lesson in endurance? In the distance, a train whistle echoed through the dark, a haunting reminder that the world beyond the fence still burned with war. Inside the barracks, the quiet struggle for dignity continued, unseen but unending. Sunday brought a rare stillness to Camp Roten. The fields rested, and the guards seemed less rigid, their voices carrying laughter instead of orders. That afternoon, a few American soldiers gathered near the mess hall with instruments, a harmonica, a battered guitar, a fiddle that glinted in the sun. The music started softly, winding through the air like smoke. It wasn't military march or victory tune. It was something else, something human. Kenji was sweeping near the fence when he heard it. The sound tugged at him, awakening an ache he hadn't felt since home. The melody rose and dipped, a strange mix of sorrow and hope. When the song ended, Sergeant Harris noticed him lingering nearby. "You play?" he asked. Kenji hesitated. "A little. Violin." Harris nodded toward the group. "They'll let you join if you've got the nerve." Kenji's heart pounded. To play music with Americans felt unthinkable, almost treasonous. But something stronger than fear urged him forward. He stepped closer, the men watching curiously. Harris handed him a worn violin from a storage crate. The strings were rough, the bow slightly warped, but it felt familiar in his hands. He tuned it quietly, his fingers trembling. Then he began to play, hesitant at first, then fuller, clearer. The song was Amazing Grace. It was one of the few tunes he'd learned from American broadcasts before the war, its melody simple yet piercing. As he played, silence spread across the camp. Even the guards by the gate stopped to listen. When the final note faded, no one spoke for several seconds. Harris finally said, "Didn't expect that kind of grace from a soldier." Kenji lowered the violin. "Grace is not owned by one side." His voice was quiet, but steady. Harris smiled faintly. Maybe that's true. The moment lingered, awkward, profound, impossible to explain. The other soldiers nodded to Kenji, some clapping gently. For a brief moment, the war, the fences, and the uniforms all seemed to disappear. That night, lying in his bunk, Kenji replayed the melody in his mind. The words of the hymn haunted him. "I once was lost, but now am found." He wasn't sure what it meant yet, but he felt it deeply. As the lights dimmed, Harris's voice echoed from the guard station. "Good playing today, Takahashi." Kenji stared into the dark and whispered, "Thank you." For the first time since his capture, the word felt real. Autumn crept into Arkansas, cooling the fields and tinting the trees a dull gold. The work continued, though the men now wore thin jackets against the wind. The rhythm of camp life had dulled into routine until the day the mail arrived. The guards carried a sack of envelopes, each one bearing foreign stamps and censored black lines across the text. When Kenji's name was called, he stepped forward, his pulse quickening. The letter was thin, written on rough paper. The handwriting was unmistakable. His younger brother, Haruto. For a long time, Kenji just held it, afraid to open it. Finally, he unfolded the page and read in silence. "Brother," the letter began, "I am still in the Pacific. Food is scarce and our unit is tired. The Americans fight hard, but I will not surrender. To die for the Emperor is to die with honor." The rest was scratched out by the censors, but the meaning was clear. Kenji's chest tightened. He imagined Haruto's thin hands gripping a rifle somewhere far across the ocean, while he himself stood here, fed, safe, and breathing American air. That evening he found Sergeant Harris near the camp office, sorting papers. "Sergeant," Kenji said softly, "my brother still fights. I live here while he starves. How can I bear that?" Harris looked up from his work. "You can't fix what's out there, Takahashi, but you can survive. Sometimes that's the only fight left." Kenji frowned. "To live while others die? How is that not shame?" Harris paused, his expression distant. "My brother died at Pearl Harbor," he said quietly. "I used to think surviving meant I owed him something. Now I think it means I remember him." For a moment neither man spoke. The air between them carried the weight of two wars, one fought with guns, the other with guilt. That night, Kenji returned to his bunk and read the letter again under the dim light. He traced his brother's name with his finger and whispered a promise he knew Haruto would never hear. "I will remember you even here." Outside, the wind rustled the barracks roof like distant surf. The camp slept, unaware of the war still raging inside its walls, a war of memory and mercy, of survival and sorrow. And as the night deepened, Kenji understood that peace would not come with the end of battle, but with the forgiveness he had yet to find. Winter winds swept through Camp Roten, cutting through the uniforms and rattling the tin roofs. The air had grown heavier since the letter from home. Rumors spread of new battles in the Pacific, of entire cities burning. The men spoke less now, their words hushed and wary. One afternoon, a stranger arrived at the camp, a Japanese man in civilian clothes, escorted by two American officers. He carried himself like a man who belonged nowhere, his accent polished, his expression unreadable. He introduced himself as Nakamura, a representative of what he called a peace movement. Through a translator, he explained that Japan's future depended on the voice of its captured soldiers. "You can serve your country even here," Nakamura said, his eyes scanning the crowd of prisoners. "America will record your words. Tell the world Japan still fights with spirit. Show them we are not broken." Some men nodded eagerly. Others, like Kenji, remained silent. He sensed something hollow in Nakamura's tone, something that smelled of propaganda. After the meeting, Lieutenant Hirose cornered him by the mess hall. "You refuse to speak," Hirose said coldly. "Do you deny your duty?" Kenji met his gaze. "My duty is to truth, not to lies that feed more war." That night, an unease settled over the barracks. Voices whispered in corners, tempers flared, and silence carried a different weight. When morning came, the entire camp was buzzing. Someone had torn the American flag from its pole and left it in the mud. The guards were furious. Harris stormed through the compound, barking questions. "Who did this?" he demanded. No one answered. The men stood rigid, their faces blank masks of denial. Then Harris turned to Kenji. "You were near the yard last night," he said. "Did you see anything?" Kenji swallowed hard. "No, Sergeant." Harris's eyes searched his face, calm but sharp. "You're sure?" "I am," Kenji said. By afternoon, he was taken to the interrogation office. The questions were measured, polite but relentless. "Do you know who did it? Did you help? Why protect the guilty?" Kenji said only one thing: "I did not dishonor the flag." As night fell, he sat alone in a cold room, wondering which flag truly bound him now, the one of his homeland, or the unseen banner of conscience that no nation owned. Outside, the wind tore through the trees, carrying no answer at all. The interrogation lasted through the night. Kenji sat beneath the dim light, his hands resting on the table, his eyes steady. The American officer across from him asked the same questions again and again, his tone neither cruel nor kind, just patient. "Did you remove the flag, Corporal Takahashi?" "No," Kenji answered, his voice calm but dry. "I did not." The officer studied him for a long moment, then sighed and nodded toward the guard. "Take him back." When dawn broke, Kenji was escorted out. The cold air hit his face like water, and as he crossed the yard he saw the flagpole standing empty. A new flag would rise soon, but for now the sky above it was bare. Inside the barracks, whispers filled the air. Some men avoided his gaze, others looked at him with suspicion. Lieutenant Hirose's glare followed him like a shadow. "They question you because you act like one of them," he muttered under his breath. "You speak their tongue, you follow their rules. What did you expect?" Kenji didn't reply. He sat on his bunk, exhausted but silent. Later that morning, Sergeant Harris approached, holding a folded sheet of paper. "You're cleared," he said simply. "They found your name on the night duty roster. You weren't anywhere near the yard." Kenji exhaled slowly, but there was no relief. "Someone wanted this," he said, "to turn us against each other." Harris's expression softened. "Sometimes the hardest fight isn't with the enemy, but with the people who are supposed to stand beside you." Word spread quickly that Kenji was innocent. A few men nodded to him again. Most said nothing. That evening, Harris stopped by the barracks, offering him a cigarette. Kenji declined, but thanked him anyway. Harris lingered for a moment, studying him. "You didn't break," he said. "That counts for something." Kenji looked away. A man shouldn't have to break to prove he's honest. As night fell, a sense of fragile calm returned to the camp. The next morning, a new American flag was raised. The fabric fluttered against the winter wind, bright and defiant. Kenji watched it ripple above the fence. He felt no anger, no loyalty, just a quiet realization that truth, like freedom, had a cost. And though he was still a prisoner, for the first time, he understood the value of standing firm even when no one believed him. The frost arrived early that year. Each morning the ground outside the barracks glimmered white, and the men's breath rose in faint clouds as they marched to their assignments. The air bit through the fabric of their uniforms, but work did not stop. The war still raged somewhere beyond those fences, and even prisoners had their duties. Kenji was assigned to the construction crew, building storage barns near the edge of the compound. The wood was heavy and cold to the touch, the nails stiff with frost. His fingers often went numb, yet he worked steadily, measuring, cutting, lifting, each motion a small act of endurance. Sergeant Harris watched from a short distance, offering advice but never interference. "You're good with your hands," he said one afternoon as Kenji balanced a beam into place. "I was a teacher," Kenji replied, hammering the nail carefully. "Not a builder." Harris smiled faintly. "Then you're learning something new." By midday, the men huddled around small fires to eat their lunch, bread, stew, and coffee that tasted faintly of metal. Conversation was minimal. Some complained of the cold. Others spoke quietly of home. Kenji rarely joined in. He found comfort in silence, in the rhythm of work that numbed both body and thought. Yet in those quiet hours, reflection crept in. He thought of his brother, of the letter now folded and worn in his pocket. He thought of Harris's strange kindness, of how easily respect could cross the boundaries of war. And he wondered whether the lines between honor and survival had blurred so much that neither meant what it once did. That evening, as the men packed away their tools, a gust of wind tore through the yard, carrying with it the sharp scent of pine. The sun was setting, bleeding orange light across the frozen earth. Kenji stood for a moment, watching it fade behind the trees. "It's beautiful here," he said quietly, almost to himself. Harris, standing nearby, nodded. "Sometimes I forget to notice." Back inside, the barracks filled with the low hum of conversation and the crackle of the stove. Kenji lay in his bunk, his muscles aching, but his mind strangely clear. For the first time since his capture, he felt something close to peace. Not victory, not freedom, but the fragile understanding that dignity could survive even in confinement. And as sleep pulled him under, he knew that was a battle worth winning. By the spring of 1945, whispers drifted through Camp Roten like the wind that rustled the wire fences. The guards spoke quietly among themselves, and the prisoners, sharp-eared from habit, caught fragments, words like Tokyo, surrender, atomic. None of it sounded real. Kenji noticed the change before anyone explained it. The guards seemed lighter, their laughter easier. The radio in the mess hall played longer, louder, but inside the barracks the air felt heavier. Some men prayed. Others sat in silence, staring at the floorboards, as if waiting for news that could either set them free or erase everything they'd lived for. During work detail, Harris joined Kenji by the storage barn. He leaned on a shovel, his face weathered but calm. "It's ending soon," he said quietly. Kenji looked up. "The war?" Harris nodded. "That's what they're saying. Japan's running out of fight." Kenji's pulse quickened. The thought of peace should have been comforting, but instead it filled him with dread. "Then what happens to us?" Harris shrugged. "You go home, I guess. Back to whatever's left." That night, Kenji wrote in his notebook, his handwriting trembling slightly. "If the war ends, what am I returning to? A country that believes death is honor, or a world that forgave me for living?" The next morning, during roll call, one of the guards handed him a small package. Inside was a worn book, the Bible. A note was tucked between the pages. "For when you can't find answers anywhere else." It was signed simply Harris. Kenji stared at the object for a long time. He had no religion, but he understood the gesture. It wasn't about faith. It was about peace. Later, he found Harris outside and said, "In my country, we give gifts when we part ways. Is that what this is?" Harris smiled faintly. "Maybe. Or maybe it's just something that helped me once." Kenji held the book close to his chest. "Then I will keep it." As days passed, tension built like an unspoken storm. The air was filled with rumors, of bombs, of cities destroyed, of an emperor ready to surrender. The men no longer dreamed of escape. They dreamed of what waited beyond the wire. Kenji sat awake long after lights out, the Bible resting beside his bunk, and wondered what kind of man peace would allow him to become. The announcement came on a humid August morning. The guards gathered the men in the yard, their faces unreadable. A crackling voice from the loudspeaker spoke the words no one expected to hear. Japan had surrendered. The war was over. For a long moment, silence held the camp still. Then the sound of cheering erupted from the guard posts. Somewhere beyond the wire, a radio blared, "God bless America." The prisoners stood motionless, caught between disbelief and something they couldn't yet name. Kenji's mind felt hollow. He thought of his brother, Haruto. Was he alive when the Emperor's voice broke through the radio in Japan? Had he laid down his rifle, or fallen before he could hear that it was done? The questions burned, but there were no answers. Harris found him later by the fence, staring out toward the horizon. "It's finished," he said quietly. "You'll be going home soon." Kenji nodded slowly. "Home," he repeated as if testing the word. "But what kind of home welcomes those who surrendered?" Harris's gaze softened. The kind that needs men who've seen enough of war to want peace more than pride. Kenji looked down at his hands, the skin rough from labor. In your country, do soldiers ever feel shame when they win? Harris paused before answering. Sometimes victory doesn't always feel clean. The days that followed were strange. The Americans celebrated with rations of beer and laughter that echoed into the night. The prisoners watched in silence. A few wept openly, others prayed, and some just sat, staring at the flag that still waved above the camp. It wasn't hatred they felt. It was something closer to emptiness. Kenji opened his notebook and wrote a single sentence. When the guns fall silent, the heart must find its own sound. He closed it and slipped it into his coat. That evening, as the sky turned a deep orange, Harris walked past the barracks and stopped. "I'll miss talking with you," he said. Kenji bowed his head slightly. "You taught me more than you know, Sergeant." Harris smiled faintly. "Guess we both learned something about the other side." As darkness fell, the camp settled into uneasy quiet. Beyond the fences, fireworks burst from a nearby town, celebrating victory. Inside, Kenji watched the faint glow against the sky, and thought not of winning or losing, but of what it meant to begin again. Weeks passed after the announcement of surrender, and the camp transformed in quiet, deliberate ways. Guards who once kept their distance now spoke freely with the prisoners. Barbed wire still stood, but its meaning had changed. The men were no longer enemies, just soldiers waiting to go home. Kenji noticed that even the air seemed lighter. The fields had gone still, the work halted. Every day the Americans handed out papers for processing, preparing for the men's return to Japan. But beneath the calm there was tension, the uncertainty of what awaited beyond the fence. One morning Sergeant Harris approached him with a folded paper and a soft expression. "Orders came through," he said. "You're scheduled to leave next week." Kenji nodded. "I thought I'd be glad," he said quietly, "but I'm not sure what I feel." "That's normal," Harris replied. "Going home after something like this, it's not the same home you remember." Later that day, as the sun dipped low, Harris found Kenji again by the fence. He held out a small object, a pocket watch, its silver face worn and scratched. "I've had this since before the war," he said. "Helped me keep time through a lot of bad days. I figure it might do the same for you." Kenji hesitated. "I can't take this." "You can," Harris said. "Consider it a reminder. Time keeps moving no matter what side we're on." Kenji accepted the gift with both hands, bowing deeply. From his coat pocket, he pulled a tiny paper crane, folded with careful precision. "Then take this," he said. "In my country, we say 1,000 cranes bring peace. One should be enough between us." Harris smiled, tucking the crane into his breast pocket. "I'll keep it safe." The next morning, the camp gathered as the first group of prisoners boarded the trucks. The sound of boots on gravel echoed through the yard. Men exchanged handshakes, nods, and brief farewells. When Kenji reached Harris, they stood in silence for a moment before Harris said, "You're free now, Takahashi. Make it mean something." Kenji met his eyes. "I will." As the truck pulled away, the camp grew smaller behind him, fading into the horizon. The watch ticked softly in his hand, a sound steady and human. For the first time since his capture, Kenji felt the strange, uncertain weight of freedom. The ship docked at Yokohama under a gray sky, its deck crowded with men whose faces carried both relief and dread. The war was over, but the silence that greeted them felt heavier than the sound of battle. Japan lay in ruins. Smoke still rose from distant cities, and the air smelled faintly of ash. Kenji stepped onto the pier, clutching Harris's pocket watch, its ticking a fragile reminder that life continued. Around him, the returning prisoners were met not with celebration, but with suspicion. Whispers followed them, words like coward and traitor. For many, surrender was not survival. It was disgrace. At a checkpoint, an officer in a tattered uniform inspected their documents. His eyes were cold. "You surrendered to the enemy?" he asked, his tone sharp with contempt. Kenji met his gaze calmly. "I was captured, not surrendered. I lived to come home." The officer snorted. "Some would say that's worse." He stamped the papers and waved him through. Beyond the harbor, the streets of Tokyo were almost unrecognizable. Buildings stood hollow and broken. Children scavenged for scraps, and women carried buckets of water through the rubble. Kenji walked slowly, his steps uncertain. The Japan he'd left behind, the proud nation of discipline and beauty, was gone. He reached his old neighborhood where his family's home had once stood. It was now an empty lot, the stone foundation half buried beneath weeds. Kenji knelt and pressed his hand to the cold earth. He had no tears left, only silence. That evening he found shelter at a small temple converted into a refuge for displaced families. The monk there, an old man with kind eyes, offered him a bowl of rice. "You've come back from the other side," the monk said softly. "Many do not." Kenji nodded. "I came back, but I'm not sure who I am now." The monk studied him for a moment, then said, "Perhaps that's the beginning of peace." As night fell, Kenji lay awake, listening to the faint hum of distant voices. He thought of Harris, of the camp, of the lessons learned among those he once called enemies. The world had changed, but so had he. He opened the watch, watching the hands move steadily through the dark. Its ticking echoed in the hollow room, a small, persistent reminder that time, like hope, refused to stop. Months passed, and winter returned to Japan with a quiet, relentless chill. The ruins of Tokyo began to stir with fragile signs of recovery. Markets reopened, children played among broken walls, and people spoke in low, careful tones about rebuilding. Kenji found work as a teacher again, this time in a small makeshift school set up inside an abandoned factory. The walls were cracked, the windows shattered, but the room was filled with voices eager to learn. His students were children who had never known peace. They asked questions not about history or mathematics, but about life before the war. "Sensei," one boy asked, "did the Americans treat you badly?" Kenji paused, his chalk hovering above the board. "No," he said finally. "They treated me as a man even when I didn't believe I deserved it." The boy frowned. "But they were the enemy." Kenji nodded. "Yes, and that's what made it harder to understand." After class, he often sat alone, writing in a notebook that had survived his captivity. He called his essay "Work Without Chains." In it, he wrote about the dignity he found in labor, about how a man's worth was not decided by the nation he served, but by how he carried himself when everything else was taken away. The essay spread quietly among educators and former soldiers who longed for something beyond shame and silence. One afternoon, a young woman from a local newspaper visited his classroom. "Are you the teacher who was once a prisoner?" she asked. Kenji met her gaze steadily. "I was a soldier," he said, "and then a prisoner. Now I am only a man trying to teach peace." She smiled faintly. "People are saying your words give them hope." Hope. The word felt unfamiliar on his tongue. He looked out the window at the children playing in the yard. "If hope is a seed," he said softly, "then it must be planted in the soil of truth." That night he walked through the streets as the city lights flickered weakly to life. The sound of hammers echoed from distant construction sites. For the first time, he saw not destruction, but renewal. As he reached the steps of the small temple where he still lodged, Kenji looked up at the sky, clear, unbroken, and wide, and whispered to himself, "Maybe this is how peace begins. One lesson, one life, at a time." Years slipped by quietly, and Japan transformed from the ashes of its defeat. Cities rose again, lights returned to the skyline, and the sound of laughter replaced the echo of war. Kenji Takahashi, now in his 40s, taught history at a new public school in Tokyo. His students knew him as a calm, patient man who spoke not of battles, but of humanity. One afternoon, after class, he visited a new cultural center built by American and Japanese veterans to honor reconciliation. The air smelled faintly of cedar and new paint. Inside, the walls were lined with black and white photographs from the war, faces young and solemn, both Japanese and American. As he walked slowly along the exhibits, one photo stopped him in his tracks. It showed a group of men standing in front of a barracks, smiling faintly. Behind them, a wooden sign read Camp Roten, Arkansas, 1945. There in the center was Kenji himself, thin, sunburned, holding a violin, and beside him stood Sergeant William Harris. He stared at the image for a long time, the noise of the room fading into silence. A small placard beneath the photo read, "Japanese POWs at Camp Roten, where mutual respect grew amidst conflict." An attendant noticed him lingering. "You knew them?" she asked. Kenji nodded. "Yes," he said softly. "I was one of them." She smiled gently. "You look at peace now." He hesitated, then said, "Peace is not given. It's learned." Leaving the exhibit, Kenji stepped outside into the crisp air. The city buzzed with life, cars, voices, the rhythm of a nation reborn. He took the pocket watch from his coat, the one Harris had given him decades ago. It still ticked, steady as ever. He thought of Harris's words, "Time keeps moving no matter what side we're on," and of his own whispered in the camp so long ago. Grace is not owned by one side. As the afternoon light washed over the streets, Kenji closed the watch and slipped it back into his pocket. The world had changed, but the lessons endured. He looked toward the horizon, where the last traces of sunlight burned against the sea, and whispered, "War made us enemies. Work made us men." If stories like this remind you that humanity can endure even in the darkest times, subscribe and stay with us, because the past still has truths worth remembering.